Member for Coquitlam-Maillardville.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to take my place in the debate on Bill 23, the Anti-Racism Act. I'm also very pleased, Mr. Speaker, to be physically present in the House in order to participate in the debate. You see, Mr. Speaker, this bill was initially it was supposed to be debated at second reading last Tuesday, the first day of Passover, when typically the first couple of days of the holiday are non-work days for Jews as we celebrate our holiday. But this bill, it's about anti-racism, and this bill that greatly affects the Jewish community, last Tuesday, it was put on the agenda for debate. And so the only way on that day that I was able to consider participating while celebrating my holiday was by Zoom. So on my holiday, I sat in front of my computer in my home so that I could participate because government put it on the agenda for that day. So that in and of itself, Mr. Speaker, is an interesting commentary on how public bodies make decisions and the systemic racism that exists therein. As it turns out, of course, second reading was pushed back, but the damage, Mr. Speaker, was done. And it serves to remind us that the words of this bill don't seem to quite match the actions of this government. To be clear, Mr. Speaker, I greatly value the intent of this legislation, holding public bodies to account in order to address systemic racism by collecting the data and requiring them to develop an action plan to address inequities that might exist. This is meaningful work, and it's meaningful legislation. It's about making us and our systems work better for people, especially people of color, Indigenous people, and marginalized and minority groups. Groups of people, perhaps, who've experienced systemic racism, oftentimes for generations. So I want to take a moment to acknowledge all the folks who have come together to do this work over the past 6 or 7 years. This has been quite an undertaking that brought community leaders from numerous ethnocultural and racial communities together to identify how to proceed with this considerable undertaking. It was not easy work, Mr. Speaker. So I want to thank all the community leaders who have contributed to the thinking and the framework of this legislation. Now, Mr. Speaker, I've been paying particular attention to how and for whom this legislation is to be used, and I do have some concerns, some of which I'll raise at committee stage. But here at second reading, it's appropriate for me to speak to this legislation with broader strokes, more at the conceptual level. So I noticed that the framing for understanding and identifying who is impacted by racism and how this legislation will be implemented is oriented towards racialized communities. In other words, Mr. Speaker, people of color, or people who don't look white. And I see throughout the document that the focus is almost exclusively on racialized communities. And I see this echoed, Mr. Speaker, in the comments of the Attorney General about how she thinks of this legislation. And I quote from the CBC article, and this is what she says, quote, "The politicians who have come before her in the legislature who passed laws designed to hurt people because of the color of their skin." She then goes on to say, "The power that was wielded in that place that was directed towards racialized people in this province, you just can't even imagine the generations of pain and trauma and impact that that's had." And I agree with her, Mr. Speaker. And I have to say, as a non-racialized person who is part of a minority group and is now regularly attacked for being a Jew, I can vouch for the impact, the pain, and the trauma that hate can have not just on one person, but on an entire community. Non-racialized communities, like communities of faith, also get impacted by government policies. I think of the Doukhobors, Mr. Speaker, for example. The Doukhobors were just here and received an apology on behalf of all of government. Mr. Speaker, Muslim communities aren't made up of exclusively racialized people, and neither are Jewish communities. We come in all colors. Yet we experience hate and experience government policies that can exclude, cause pain and trauma. When I moved to British Columbia from Montreal in 1978, Mr. Speaker, I was in junior high school. I know that Mr. Speaker wasn't yet born. And I'd gone to public school my entire life back in Montreal, never experienced discrimination or exclusion as a result of government policy while I was living there. But here in BC, I was shocked that the Lord's Prayer was said every morning over the public address system while I was going to school in Richmond. I didn't know the words. It wasn't my prayer. So in order to accommodate, and I use air quotes, my unique Jewish needs and the needs of a sick classmate who was in my class at the time, we were instructed to stand out in the hallway for the 2 to 3 minutes of the Lord's Prayer so that we wouldn't have to listen to it. However, it didn't help that the public address system was also out in the hallway, and that singling us out as somehow different wasn't seen as creating a problem. But I can vouch for those of us who were singled out as different, that it was very painful. Now, this was a school board policy or a school policy, I don't know which, but I can certainly say, Mr. Speaker, that it excluded and traumatized children. So I think we need clarity about who this legislation is for. The government says in the bill that it will work with racialized communities on a go-forward basis. I happen to think, Mr. Speaker, that that's a problem. How are communities that experience discrimination who are non-racialized participating in this process? Are they considered groups to be addressed? Another problem, Mr. Speaker, that government has around this legislation is the fact that the organized Jewish community has very serious reservations about working with the current parliamentary secretary for anti-racism initiatives. She has a long history of perceived anti-Semitic comments, and the government's response to those concerns has been to single out the Jewish community to work directly with the Attorney General, while all the other communities work with the parliamentary secretary. It sort of, Mr. Speaker, reminds me of my junior high days when I was sent out to the hallway while the Lord's Prayer was being recited. This is not inclusion. It's actually racism and discrimination, Mr. Speaker. So I started my comments highlighting the fact, Mr. Speaker, that this government saw fit to debate a bill on racism on a Jewish holiday when the only openly identified practicing Jew in this chamber would not be available to participate in second reading debate given her holiday. Ignorance of the holiday, perhaps? Not likely. In fact, on the Monday of last week, before sundown and the beginning of the holiday of Passover, the government put out Passover greetings to BC's Jewish community. That is merely 40,000 members strong here in British Columbia. And in it, the government notes that the Jewish community has been experiencing a troubling time. This is what the Premier had to say to the Jewish community on Monday night. This year, Passover comes at a painful time for many Jewish people. Just over 6 months ago, Hamas terrorists invaded Israeli communities and attacked innocent civilians in what was the deadliest act of violence against Jewish people since the Holocaust. Since the October 7th attack, we've been deeply troubled. We see a deeply troubling rise in antisemitism here in BC. Our government condemns all forms of hate and is taking action to make sure our province is safe and welcoming for people of all faiths and backgrounds. This work includes, and this is the list that the Premier listed, making Holocaust education mandatory for all high school students, establishing an anti-hate community support fund, launching a racist incident helpline, and supporting organizations that are doing anti-racism work. It goes on to say that in these difficult times, we must stand together against all forms of hate to ensure BC remains a place where everyone can celebrate their culture and practice their religion with pride and without fear. I wish a peaceful Passover to all who are marking the occasion. I'm sure that the Speaker and everyone else who is listening to this can see some of the contradictions of those greetings and then what my experience was. I do appreciate that the Premier and government acknowledge the pain the Jewish community is experiencing at this very fraught time, and I appreciate the acknowledgement that the recent rise in anti-Semitism is very troubling. It's troubling indeed, Mr. Speaker. In fact, last Monday, as I was preparing for a Passover Seder, a formal dinner, and I was somewhere between making gefilte fish and setting up a formal dinner table for 19 people that were coming to my home, I decided I should check my work emails. As I scrolled through, I came across a particularly disturbing email from a constituent who had received a photo of anti-Semitic graffiti in the bus stop by Coquitlam City Hall. The graffiti read, Mr. Speaker, "Kill Jews," accompanied by a swastika. Now, this is the third time in 2 months that this kind of anti-Semitism in my community has been brought to my attention. In the 30 years that I have made Coquitlam my home, I had never seen anything like what we are seeing today. And now the city of Coquitlam is spending upward of $5,000 a month cleaning up hateful anti-Semitic graffiti that continues to reappear on a weekly basis. Last week, I had a brief conversation, Mr. Speaker, with my local RCMP about this hateful anti-Semitic graffiti that keeps appearing in my community. And not just in my community, Mr. Speaker. I know it is across all communities. And I was told by this RCMP officer that they would be happy to arrest these perpetrators because, you know, Mr. Speaker, they know who they are. These perpetrators who spread hate intended to intimidate and terrorize Jews. However, the RCMP member said to me that the Crown isn't interested in pressing charges because, and I quote, the graffiti just washes off and doesn't cause damage, end quote. Well, Mr. Speaker, I can vouch for the damage it causes. Perhaps the bench or the wall or the bus stop, they can be hosed down. The pain that comes with seeing those markings can be just washed away. But the damage to one's spirit is significant. And as long as our public bodies don't recognize and take hate in all its forms seriously, we are failing to keep our communities safe. The Premier, in his note on Passover, provides a list of the ways his government is, and I quote again, taking action. This is the same list that he's been using for 5 months to demonstrate government's actions to fight the rise in anti-Semitism. Yes, the funds for additional security are welcome, but what other community has to have extra police officers at community events in this moment, right here, right now? What other community has to hire security to escort speakers to venues, right here, right now? What other community has to advise their children not to wear their school uniforms or their Jewish star in order to hide their Jewish identity because it is not safe right here, right now? What other community has to train community volunteers to help with security issues right here, right now? What about the other actions that the Premier notes in his Passover message to the Jewish community? Well, the Premier, the House Leader, and the Attorney General continually point to Holocaust education as part of their response to the dramatic rise in anti-Semitism. Well, Mr. Speaker, that work was well underway years before the increase in Jew hatred started. So it's not a direct response to the increase in hatred since October 7th. And furthermore, how the heck will mandatory Holocaust education that won't be mandatory until 2025 help those being terrorized today, right here, right now? And supporting organizations that do anti-racism work, also part of the list? Well, Mr. Speaker, government has always supported organizations in anti-racism work. So this isn't a new response to the increase in Jew hatred. And that anti-racism hotline that the Premier refers to, somehow as a response to the rise in anti-Semitism, well, that was announced and promised back in April 2021, but it's still not operational. So that too is not at all in response or effective in addressing the rise in anti-racism here in the province, right here, right now. And I just wish, Mr. Speaker, I just wish that the Premier would stop gaslighting the Jewish community here in British Columbia, right here and right now. The only thing on the table from this government to address the rise in Jew hatred is a bit of money for security, hoping to keep the community quiet with dribs and drabs of money so that they can take responsibility for keeping our community safe. That's it. Set two. There's no other action being taken to protect a community under siege. There is no plan. In fact, the Attorney General said in her words as she introduced second reading, because I listened very closely, Mr. Speaker, she said, the establishment of the requirement for government to develop and publish an anti-racism action plan is for June 1st, 2026. That's what this legislation is about. This action plan will be developed in consultation and cooperation with Indigenous peoples and through engagement with racialized communities. The action plan will include actions to address the harms caused by systemic racism specific to Indigenous people, Islamophobia, and anti-Semitism. So there's no real actions for government at this point to act on the dramatic rise in anti-Semitism today, right here and right now. And I just wish the Premier would own up to it. Even this bill has no plan. It's a bill that requires public bodies to develop a plan. And government isn't even acting on what it wants other public bodies to act on. I have to tell you, Mr. Speaker, this is literally crazy-making. It's gaslighting and it's crazy-making. Mr. Speaker, this week I read Rob Shaw's article contrasting the leadership between the current Premier and the former Premier, John Horgan. It's an interesting analysis. I encourage people to read it. It's analysis about ownership and responsibility for decisions made. Now, under Premier Horgan's leadership, I was tasked as a member of caucus and as a member of cabinet. I was tasked as an openly identified Jew who is well connected to the Jewish community to help government understand the needs of the community, to translate when needed, and to help facilitate a relationship with the community. In other words, I was tasked, Mr. Speaker, to be the Jew in the crew, bringing all that I am, bringing my relationships, my understanding, my history, my culture, to make sure that government is doing right by the community. In fact, Mr. Speaker, John Horgan used to say when he would meet with the Jewish community, when he would meet with Holocaust survivors, or he would go to synagogue on Kristallnacht, he would always check in with me afterwards. Did I do okay? Was I a mensch? Mensch meaning good person with a good soul. He wanted to do right by the community. It was important to him as a human being and as a leader. Under the current regime, Mr. Speaker, the message to me has been, don't be too Jewish. That creates a problem for us. I was told I needed to leave a job I love, Mr. Speaker, because I was too Jewish. What's more, Mr. Speaker, as I think about it, and I think about the pain it's caused not just to me, but to my entire community, they feel betrayed, let down, discouraged by the legislation that we have before us. How can you trust a government to do right by you when they don't hear your cries for help? Mr. Speaker, I'd said earlier in my remarks that I listened quite closely to what the Attorney General had to say. In her opening remarks, she said that this legislation is important because they are, and I quote, confirming investment in programs and services to heal communities affected by racism. It's good. I think that is government's job. Government's job is to help heal. It's to help bring communities together. It is to help communities get over the hard parts. Well, Mr. Speaker, I propose to do just as the attorney suggested in her remarks. I proposed to the Premier and to this government before I left caucus a program and an idea to heal 2 communities affected by racism. And what was I told by the Premier's office? I was told it's too political. That the political cost of doing that work in this moment, right here, right now, was too threatening to a re-election. That's how I heard it, Mr. Speaker. Doesn't matter if communities are hurting. Doesn't matter if they are feeling isolated, if they are feeling afraid. Now's not the time because we have an election in 6 months. Mr. Speaker, when the government House Leader chooses to attack the member from Vancouver, Langara, when he asks what government is doing to address the rise in antisemitism, and instead of answering the question, the government House Leader chooses to attack and bring up the quick win scandal, I say that this government is no different. To date, the actions of the current government, this new Democrat government, when dealing with anti-Semitism, whether it's on campuses across our province or in our streets, the only thing the Premier has done is to wring his hands and say that he condemns these acts, condemns what people are saying. But he hasn't actually done anything. He hasn't gone to visit synagogues, Jewish day schools. He hasn't gone out to talk to Jewish community groups. Oh, I know he met with a rabbi, and I know that he met, finally, he and the Attorney General met with the Special Envoy on Antisemitism. She started her job in November. The Attorney General got the file in November as well, but only in April they meet with her? Only because people are saying you need to meet with them? And when the Premier does speak, when he does speak out, he acts as if there's nothing he and government can or should do. I was listening very carefully to his words, Mr. Speaker. He regularly leaves the actions to university presidents or to the AMS leadership. He sort of pretends like he doesn't have a role or that government doesn't have a role in stemming a tide of hate, vitriol, and violence directed toward a minority group. Mr. Speaker, there are 6 million British Columbians in this province. There are 40,000 Jews in this province. They are a minority group. And we are left out of this legislation because it only talks about working with racialized people throughout the document. And Jews are not racialized people. Now, most Jews are people of color, most Jews in the world. There's about almost 16 million Jews in the world. Most of them are darker skinned. But here in British Columbia, that's not the case necessarily. So I think there's some serious problems with the legislation as it's written. So I look forward to the committee stage of this bill, Mr. Speaker. I have many questions about how this bill will be implemented in many systems, like our public service, where I, Mr. Speaker, hear stories of employees of this public service being told that their Jewish star that they wear is offensive and should be removed. Or on a land acknowledgement, on Lekwungen-speaking people land, they also include a land acknowledgement that has to do someplace far in the Middle East. That's in our public service. I'm interested in how this bill will be implemented in our public school system, Mr. Speaker, where teachers in the Coquitlam School District, and I know other school districts as well, accuse Jews of apartheid, genocide, and ethnic cleansing. You heard right. It was on the website in Coquitlam School District. I've received a letter from my school district teachers saying just that. So I'm keenly interested in how this legislation will be implemented as well, Mr. Speaker, in public post-secondary institutions where, as we speak, mobs of students and faculty are using fear and intimidation that harm Jewish students, Jewish faculty, and Jewish staff. And Mr. Speaker, don't for a second think that it's just Jewish people that are affected by this. It affects everybody. It affects everybody. I'm also interested if government has any plan to ensure that government members will be taking anti-Semitism training. It's really important that government understand the insidiousness of this hatred that appears and reappears and reappears and reappears at regular intervals throughout history. It's a hatred that just won't go away. Now, Mr. Speaker, I wanted to take the Premier and the government at their word when they wished me and my family, Jewish British Columbians, a peaceful Passover. But if that was their intent, I would have thought they would truly recognize my holiday by perhaps waiting until I was back in the House before putting this bill on the agenda for the first day of Passover. Given that there wasn't even a consideration, I can only conclude that their greetings were simply performative, just like all the other things they talk about when dealing with the Jewish community and anti-Semitism. Simply performative. Perhaps government ought to start, Mr. Speaker, with their own action plan before the legislation is even passed. That would be a good start. From my perspective, Mr. Speaker, and I think I have the credibility to speak on behalf of the 40,000 Jewish British Columbians, the Premier and his caucus, and I quote, have a lot of deep work to do. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member. Member for Skeena.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker.